The first time I heard the whisper, I thought I was losing my mind. It was faint, a low, trembling voice seeping through the thin crack between my bedroom and the corridor that led to the old guest room. It wasn't words at first, just sound. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in a quiet house. I'd just returned from a 4-day business trip, still carrying the smell of airport coffee and sleepless air. My bag was on the floor, shoes half unlaced. Tie loosened, and then that noise sliced through the silence. It was almost midnight. I froze near the hallway, listening. The air had that strange stillness, the kind that lives in houses where something has gone terribly wrong. Then came another sound, a soft thud, followed by a whimper. For a moment, I told myself it was the wind. The window frames in this old house often complained when the temperature dropped, and November nights were cruel here. But then I heard it again, a voice, this time clearer and older. The tone, fragile, rasping, like dry paper being crumpled. Please, please. Every hair on my neck rose. I stepped toward the sound, heart thumping, slow but heavy. The voice came from behind the locked door of the guest room, the one my son had told me to keep closed because he was renovating it. For 3 weeks, he'd insisted it was off limits, that it was full of tools, paint, and electrical wires. He'd even placed a lock I didn't remember buying. At the time, I didn't question him. He was my son, my blood. But that night, as the whispers grew into choked sobs, I realized something far darker lived behind that door. "Who's there?" I called out. No answer. I jiggled the doorknob. Locked. Then I heard it, my name. Spoken in a cracked voice I hadn't heard in years, a voice I had buried in memory and mourning. "Son." "Help me." The world narrowed to a pinpoint. I knew that voice. I would have known it in a storm, across decades, across the grave. It was my father, the man I had buried 7 years ago. Everything inside me went still. My mind screamed it was impossible, yet my heart recognized him instantly. The pitch, the rhythm, the faint tremor he always had when speaking after long days in the workshop. I grabbed the handle again. "Dad!" Silence. Then a shallow breath, almost a sob. "Yes." "Please, open!" I kicked the door. Once, twice. The old wood splintered. On the third hit, it gave way. The smell hit me first, a mix of sweat, dampness, and neglect. The lights were dim, one bulb flickering above a cluttered room that looked more like a prison cell than a guest bedroom. And there in the corner, sitting against the wall with trembling hands and hollow eyes, was the ghost I thought I'd buried. My father, alive. His face was gaunt, skin pale and clinging to bone, eyes glassy with disbelief as he looked at me. A dirty blanket was wrapped around his shoulders. His lips trembled. "Son." They said, "You knew." I dropped to my knees beside him, trembling. "Knew? What?" "They said you—" agreed to it. "That you left me here." My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. I turned and saw the lock heavy, new, with scratches from the inside. And beside it, a tray with untouched food, stale bread, half a glass of water. 3 days old, maybe more. I tried to lift him, but he winced in pain. His wrists bore faint bruises, and the air in the room carried the smell of fear-old sweat, dry tears, and metal. "Who did this?" I whispered. His lips moved, barely forming words. "Your son." The world went silent. For a few seconds I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe. Just the sound of the flickering bulb filled the room like a pulse. Then something inside me cracked, not loudly, not violently, but in the quiet way an old door gives way after too many winters. People often imagine betrayal as a scream, a fight, a storm. But it isn't. It's the silence afterward, the way the house still stands, but never feels like home again. As I helped my father to his feet, my mind reeled back through time. Every small moment began to stitch itself together, every excuse. Every lie my son had told, every look that didn't make sense. 3 months ago, he'd insisted on managing my father's estate, handling what remained of his assets after the funeral. He'd been ambitious, bold, always the smartest in the room. I'd admired that. He said he'd help clean up the legal mess Grandpa left behind. I trusted him completely. I thought he was honoring the family, but apparently, while I was signing papers, he was burying the truth, literally, that night. After I got my father water and called the doctor, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the floorboards. My house, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like enemy territory. Every object looked suspicious. Every shadow carried deceit. I thought about my son, how proud I'd been when he graduated, how I'd stood at his wedding, hand on his shoulder, promising his wife he'd be the kind of man who'd protect her no matter what. I'd spent years working, traveling, missing birthdays and anniversaries, so he could inherit stability, and this was the result. When dawn broke, I was still awake. The doctor had taken my father to the hospital. He was dehydrated, malnourished, and traumatized, but alive. Alive, the word itself burned in my mind like a brand. He had survived. My son's deception had not killed him. But something else had died that night. The illusion that I had raised a good man. I remember sitting at the hospital, listening to the steady beep of the monitor beside my father's bed. The room smelled of antiseptic and old flowers. He was asleep, and I watched the lines on his face. He looked smaller, older, almost childlike, and I realized, somewhere along the way, our family had built walls instead of homes, secrets instead of memories. We had become a house of polite lies. That was the morning I stopped being a father blinded by affection. That was the morning I became something else, a man preparing to unearth every lie buried in his name. When I returned home later that day, my son was waiting for me in the living room. He smiled, casual, confident the same way he used to after winning a debate as a teenager. "Hey, Dad, you're back early." I said nothing. He was sitting in my chair, the one beside the fireplace. Legs crossed, sleeves rolled up, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked comfortable, too comfortable. "I got your message," he continued. "Everything okay? You sounded weird." Weird, that word. Like I hadn't just dragged his grandfather, his own flesh and blood, out of a locked room in our house. "Where were you last night?" I asked. He blinked, caught off guard. "Out, with friends. Why?" I studied his face, that smirk, the practiced calm, the slight twitch near his left eye that always betrayed his nerves. "The guest room," I said quietly. "Open it," he chuckled. "What?" "Open it," I repeated. My tone made him hesitate. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tried to smile again. "Dad, are you okay?" "You sound," I cut him off. "You locked your grandfather in there." "For how long?" His smile froze. The silence that followed was longer than any scream. Then slowly he set the glass down. "Dad, whatever you think, don't," I said. "Don't finish that sentence." He stood, exhaling through his nose, calculating. I could see it, the gears turning. He wasn't panicking. He was planning, like me. And that's when I realized just how dangerous he had become. When I was young, my father used to say, "Evil doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits across the table smiling." Now I understood. I didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't demand answers. Because I knew deep down that this wasn't the moment for fury. This was the moment for patience. Justice doesn't need noise. It needs timing, so I looked him in the eyes and simply said, "We'll talk later." Then I left the room quietly, deliberately, because I had already decided. This story wouldn't end in anger. It would end in silence, the kind of silence that destroys lies. I did not sleep that night. Even after the doctor left. After my father was stable and the house went still, My mind replayed every detail like a broken film reel. The sound of the lock snapping, the trembling voice whispering my name, the flicker of that single light bulb over his head, the smell of mold in that room. Each image branded itself into me, line by line, as if memory wanted to make sure I never forgot the taste of betrayal. At sunrise, the house looked different. The same furniture, the same walls, but it all felt wrong. The air was heavier, charged with something rotten and invisible. Betrayal has a smell, you know. It clings to fabric, to doorknobs, to the spaces where laughter used to live. I walked through each room like a stranger inspecting someone else's life. The living room still carried the faint scent of my son's cologne. The same one I had given him last Christmas, a gift that now smelled like deceit. The photo frames on the wall told the story of a man I thought I knew. Him as a boy sitting on my shoulders. Him on his graduation day. Him holding his newborn daughter. But the man who smiled in those photos had turned into someone else. Someone capable of locking his own grandfather in a room and pretending he was dead. I stared at one picture for a long time. It was taken 10 years ago on the front porch. My father had his arm around my son, both of them laughing at something my wife had said. The sunlight had caught their faces just right. They looked like family. The kind of picture you see in frames sold at stores, staged, perfect, warm. I remember thinking, at that moment, that our legacy was safe. Now looking at it, all I could think was, where did we lose it? Later that morning, I sat beside my father's hospital bed. He was awake, his hands trembling as he reached for mine. His fingers were colder than I remembered. The nurse had given him some broth, but he barely touched it. "I thought you were gone," I whispered. His eyes moved toward me, clouded but sharp with pain. "That boy. He said you signed the papers. He said you wanted everything closed quickly." "What papers?" I asked. "The inheritance ones," he said weakly. He showed me documents. "Told me you wanted your share early, that I was being moved to a facility until things were finalized. When I refused to sign, he locked the door." The words slid into me like knives. I had indeed signed something months ago, a thick folder of estate documents that my son said the lawyer had prepared. I hadn't read them carefully. My trust in him had blinded me. The irony was unbearable. He looked at me again, voice breaking. "He brought food," spoke kindly, said it was temporary. Then he stopped coming. The room fell quiet except for the hum of the heart monitor. Each beep was a reminder that my father was still here, but barely. I wanted to scream. I wanted to punch the walls, the air, the past, but I didn't. Instead, I nodded slowly because rage is too loud, and I needed to stay quiet to think. Quiet is where strategy lives. On my way home, I passed the old repair shop where my father had worked his whole life. The windows were dusty now, the sign faded, but the name was still there. Our family name, the one my son had turned into a transaction. I parked the car and sat there, staring at the building. Inside, the benches and tools were still arranged the way my father had left them. A thick smell of oil and wood hung in the air. I walked in and ran my hand over one of the work tables. The surface was rough, carved with initials and burn marks from decades of hard labor. That smell of iron, oil, and sweat was the smell of honesty. I remembered being a boy, watching my father fix things that everyone else had given up on. He'd always say, "There's nothing truly broken." Only misunderstood. I had carried that belief through my life, through marriage, through business, through fatherhood. But now I was looking at the wreckage of something that could not be repaired. Not easily, not gently. My father's words echoed in my mind. He said you agreed to it. And in that echo, a seed of quiet rage began to grow. The following days moved slowly. I kept visiting the hospital, talking little, observing more. My father's color was returning, but his silence lingered. He didn't want to speak about the days he spent locked up. The only time he broke the silence was when the nurse changed his IV and he whispered, "I heard him laugh outside the door." That sentence haunted me. I drove home that night in the rain, the sound of wipers scratching across the windshield like impatient fingers. The streets were empty. Neon reflections from old street lamps rippled on the wet asphalt. My son's car wasn't in the driveway. It often wasn't lately. When I entered the house, the clock in the hallway read 11:47 p.m. the exact same time I'd first heard the whispers. The house seemed to hold its breath as I walked past the locked door, now broken, and into my study. I poured myself a drink, though I hardly tasted it. My hand rested on the old wooden desk that had once belonged to my father. I could almost feel the energy of his craftsmanship in the grain. Then I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a small metal box, the one where I kept old documents and family records. Birth certificates, contracts, insurance papers. As I sifted through them, something caught my eye. A document I didn't remember signing. My own signature was there, neat and clear, but the notary's seal looked off, fainter. The paper itself felt newer than it should have. The document stated that I had transferred managerial control of my father's estate to my son permanently and without contest. It was dated exactly 1 week after the day my father was declared dead. My hands went cold. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. He had forged more than loyalty. He had forged legality. The next morning, I met with an old friend, a retired attorney named Victor. We'd known each other since college. He listened carefully as I laid out the details, each revelation darker than the last. When I finished, he leaned back, rubbed his chin, and said, "You realize what this means, right? If you push this, it's not just fraud. It's abduction. Possibly attempted murder." I nodded. My throat felt dry, but he continued, "You need evidence. Not suspicion, not anger. Paper, recordings, witnesses. The law doesn't care about feelings. It cares about proof." I stared out the window. The city looked gray and indifferent. "Then I'll get proof," I said quietly. "Every piece." That night, as I sat on the edge of my bed, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A message alert on my phone. It was from my son. "Dad, we need to talk. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Let's clear this up privately. Privately." That word again. The word he always used when he wanted to manipulate control. When he wanted the truth buried under civility, I didn't respond. Instead, I saved the message. A small piece of digital evidence, one of many I would soon collect. For the next few days, I began to notice the subtler things. The way he avoided eye contact, the sudden withdrawals from the joint business account, the quiet phone calls made from the porch. Once I caught him standing near the guest room door again, staring at the broken frame with a cold expression. He didn't realize I was watching from the staircase. There was no guilt in his face, just calculation. It was in that moment that I finally understood he didn't regret what he had done. He regretted being caught. That night I couldn't shake a particular image from my mind. My father, locked in that room, whispering my name into the darkness. Believing I had betrayed him, that thought was unbearable. So I went back to the garage. I turned on the single bulb that hung from the ceiling and stood there, staring at the door's remains. The lock was still on the floor. Rusted edges, new mechanism. I crouched down and ran my fingers over it. Then I noticed something else. Faint grooves carved into the inside of the door near the handle. Letters scratched with something sharp. 3 letters. MHP, my father's initials. He had been carving them, probably to prove he was there in case no one ever found him. My vision blurred. The world spun for a second. Then something settled deep inside me, colder than anger, heavier than grief. I stood up, closed my eyes, and took a long breath. There's a kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Not the kind filled with thunder and lightning, the kind that happens inside a person when they stop pleading with fate and start shaping it. That's what I felt then. I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to call the police yet. I wasn't going to tell anyone what had happened. I was going to build the truth piece by piece, quietly, carefully, until it became undeniable, because nothing destroys a lie faster than silence that gathers evidence. That was the night everything changed. Took my father's initials carved into that wood as my first clue and my first vow. Whatever it took, I would uncover every layer of deceit. I would expose my son's greed for what it was, not with violence, but with precision. And when I finally confronted him, he wouldn't even see it coming. He would watch his world unravel the same way he had watched my father starve. Slowly, helplessly, without anyone to save him. But first, I needed to plan. I needed to become invisible. I needed to become the kind of man who doesn't react, he calculates. There is a sound a house makes when truth moves in. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is a quiet rearranging of air, like a late train rolling past an empty platform. You feel it in the floorboards first, as if the place itself is preparing for a different kind of resident. That is how my home felt the morning I crossed from grief into clarity. I woke before the alarm, before the sun, with the taste of metal in my mouth and a single sentence forming in my mind. This only ends when I end it. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint tick of the hallway clock and the hummingbird buzz of the refrigerator down the hall. It was strange how clear the world suddenly sounded. The mind is a noisy machine when you cling to excuses. Once the excuses die, everything sharpens. I went to the kitchen. The tiles were cold under my feet. I could smell last night's rain drifting through the cracked window above the sink. On the counter sat the mug my son liked to use, the one with a hairline crack on the rim. He had left it there, carelessly, a faint crescent of coffee dried inside. I studied it for a moment, then turned away. Not because I felt sentimental, because I understood a lesson I should have learned years ago. Small things are everything. The crack on a mug, a faint seal on a document, a quiet word like privately. I drove to the hospital without turning on the radio. Clouds hung low over the city, heavy and gray. When I reached my father's room, a nurse was adjusting his blankets. He was awake. His eyes brightened when he saw me in the doorway. There was fear in that look, but there was trust too. It hit me like a benediction and a demand at once. Be the man he thinks you are. I sat, took his hand, and told him what mattered. That he was safe. That I knew what had been done. That I would fix it. He closed his eyes and nodded once, as if that was all he had been waiting to hear. He drifted to sleep while I watched his breath slow to a soft rhythm. The monitor made a steady sound that reminded me of a metronome. Time, discipline, patience. That was my path now. On the way out, the nurse stopped me. He keeps saying he wants to go home, she whispered. Not to your house, to his home. I pictured the old workshop with its iron smell and the faded calendar on the wall from a year no one remembered. Soon, I said. I will take him soon, but first I need to make sure the ground is solid under his feet. When I reached the parking lot, my phone chimed. Another message from my son. Dad, I am worried about you. People might twist what happened. Let me handle the paperwork, so this does not become a family embarrassment. Embarrassment. That was the word he chose for abducting an old man and forging documents. I saved the message and put the phone in my pocket. Then I stood in the drizzle for a long minute and let the water cool my jaw. I felt the last of my hesitation wash off my skin and slide into the gutter. On the drive home, I decided on the first rule. No shouting, no threats. Not a single dramatic scene unless it served a purpose. I would offer him nothing he could use against me. Not anger, not pity, not even the comfort of. Believing I was indecisive, I pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. The house stood in a flat gray light. The broken door to the guest room had been replaced overnight. My son was moving quickly. He always had. He had hired people to patch wood and repaint trim as if erasing a crime were the same as cleaning a stain. Inside, the scent of fresh paint carried through the corridor, sweet and plastic. I pressed my palm to the new door. It was smooth, unmarked, almost soft from the final coat. Behind the surface, the drywall would still carry the screws. And behind the paint, the memory of a lock remained like a ghost. Morning. Dad. His voice drifted from the kitchen. Cheerful, bright, manufactured. He stood by the stove in a crisp shirt, stirring eggs in a pan with a wooden spatula. There was a plate set for me. Coffee steaming, butter laid out, 2 slices of toast waiting. The picture of a dutiful son. I sat, watched him move, memorized his rhythm. He always kept his jaw slightly lifted when he lied. His left sleeve was rolled one fold higher than his right. He was not used to the weight of guilt. It tugged small details out of place. "Hospital again?" he asked lightly. "Yes. How is he?" "Alive." He set the plate in front of me and paused. The silence stretched open. He stepped back, wiped his hands on a towel, and attempted a smile that did not reach his eyes. "That is good. I knew you would do the right thing, Dad." I lifted the fork and let it hover over the eggs. I did not take a bite. "What do you think the right thing is?" I asked. He blinked once, only once. Then he recovered. "To keep this within the family," he said. "Hospitals ask questions. Neighbors gossip. Lawyers get rich. And you hate drama." True. I did hate drama. I returned the fork to the plate. "We will talk later," I said. "Tonight." He studied me a fraction longer than he meant to, then nodded. "Sure, tonight." He left the house moments later. I watched his car roll down the street through the slats of the blinds. When the taillights turned the corner, I let my shoulders fall. My hands were shaking, though I felt calm. The body is slower than the mind. It takes time to catch up to decisions that change it. I spent the next hours cleaning the study. It was not a real cleaning. It was a ritual. I cleared the desk, placed the documents in neat stacks, opened a lined notebook, and wrote one word at the top of the first page. Why? Then I wrote the second word. How? Under why? I listed what he had done, not what I felt. Locked an elder in a room, forged or falsified legal documents, misled family and possibly the court, obstructed medical care, stolen property under cover of authority. Under how? I started a map, who notarized the signature, which company installed the new lock, what dates appear on banking, transactions, which neighbor saw unusual, activity, where the security cameras point and whether they retain, archived footage, who owes me favors, who owes my father respect. I turned the page and wrote a third word, when not yet. Evidence first, quiet first, truth arranged in a shape that no one could deny. The drama would come later of its own accord, like thunder after lightning. I began with the notary. I took a photograph of the suspicious seal and ran my thumb over it. Then I drove to the address listed on the paperwork. The office was in a sleepy strip of one-story buildings that smelled of printers and stale air. A woman behind the counter recognized my last name and forced a smile that wobbled. "We closed out that file," she said. "I know," I replied. "I only need to confirm one thing. Did you witness this signature?" I placed the paper down. She leaned forward, hesitated, and then looked up at me with careful eyes. "No," she said finally. "That stamp is ours. The signature is not mine." "Would you put that in writing?" Her face pinched. "Is there a problem?" "There is a misunderstanding," I answered. "I would like it to end." She wrote the statement, signed it, handed it over with fingers that trembled. As I left, a photocopier coughed behind me, and the room filled with the smell of warm toner. I felt strangely grateful for that smell. It meant the world still ran on simple mechanics. Ink, paper, truth. Next, I visited the locksmith. It was the same company that had replaced the guest room door. I asked for the work order under my address. The man at the counter, an older fellow with careful hands, checked his tablet and raised his eyebrows. "Says the order came from your son," he said. "Can I get a copy of the invoice?" He printed it and slid it across the counter. He asked for a reinforced strike plate and a high-grade barrel, said it was for a safe room. Did he ask for a lock that could be opened from the inside? The man winced. No, the opposite. I stared at the invoice for a full count of 10. Then I thanked him, paid for a duplicate copy to avoid suspicion, and walked out into a thin drizzle that tasted of iron. I imagined my father's fingernails scratching, those initials into the wood, while rain fell just a few feet away on the roof. Hope can be that close to a prisoner, just a few feet away, singing on tin. By mid-afternoon, I had records from the bank that showed withdrawals tied to estate management fees paid to a company my son had incorporated under a different name. I had the filing from the clerk's office. I had a timeline that ignored accidents and pointed only to decisions. I did not feel triumphant. I felt focused, like a surgeon prepping an instrument tray. On my way back to the hospital, I stopped at the old workshop. I opened the side door with the key that still hung on my ring. Inside, the dust lay peaceful and undisturbed. I turned on the light. It buzzed and filled the room with a tired yellow glow. In one corner was the old metal cabinet where my father kept ledgers. I opened it and pulled out the last few years. There it was, a payment entry too. My son for consulting services dated 2 months before the supposed death. A note in my father's careful handwriting beside it. Not comfortable with this, I sat on the stool and pressed my fingers to the page. The paper felt like skin. So many years and thoughts had been poured into these lines. I thought of the times I had chosen convenience over conversation, speed over scrutiny, pride over presence. If justice was a house, neglect was the rot in its beams. I had a part in this, not the crime, the soil in which it grew. I closed the ledger and locked it again. Then I turned off the light and stood for a moment in the darkness, letting my eyes adjust. The room smelled like old metal and cedar shavings. It smelled like my childhood and like tomorrow. At dusk, I returned to the hospital. My father was awake and calm. I told him I would drive him to the workshop soon. He nodded with a small smile. Then he looked at me with a seriousness I had seen only a handful of times in my life. "Do what needs doing," he said softly, "but do not let your soul rot while you do it." I promised him I would not. When I reached home, the house was lit. My son was early. He stood in the living room with 2 glasses ready and a bottle open. He was trying to stage the scene once more. He had always been talented at arranging life so it looked like virtue. I remained standing. "Sit if you want," he said gently. "We can settle this. We will settle it," I answered. "But not the way you think." He tilted his head. "Dad, listen." Things got out of hand. I was trying to protect the family assets. Grandpa was confused. You know how he gets. You were traveling constantly and the lawyer said time was short. I had to act. "You had to lock a man in a room," I said. My voice was even. "Explain that part to me." He lifted his hands in a pleading shape. "Temporary. For his safety. He tried to leave at night. He would have gotten hurt. Then why a lock that cannot be opened from the inside?" He watched me carefully and chose not to answer. I stepped closer. He did not step back. "Tonight is not the night for excuses," I said. "It is the night I tell you the truth. I know about the forged seal. I know about the company you formed. I know where the money went and I know who installed the lock. I know which cameras you turned off and which you forgot about." His eyes flickered at that last sentence. "It was slight. Enough. I do not want to fight," he said. The voice was calm again. A father should not seek to destroy his son. I did not blink. A son should not imprison his grandfather. For a breath, the room held that sentence like a weight. He looked down first. When he looked up again, his face had changed. The concern was gone. A colder mask had slipped on. "What do you want then?" he asked. There it was. The question that divides child from adult, thief from heir. He did not ask what I needed. He asked what I wanted. It was language that betrayed a gambler. "I want the truth to hold," I said. "And I want my father to walk free in the home he built. That is all." "No," I said quietly. "But that is where it starts." He laughed a dry, thin laugh. "You will not take me to court. You hate public scenes. You will not call the police. You love me. You will talk and sigh and forgive. That is who you are." I let the silence answer him. Silence is a mirror. If you hold it long enough, people reveal themselves. He poured a drink, tossed it back, and set the glass down with a tap. "I have a meeting," he said. "We will continue this tomorrow." He walked past me. His shoulder brushed mine. For a second, I smelled the cologne I had chosen for him years ago. It smelled different now, not stronger. Cheaper somehow, because I could smell the lie behind it. The door closed. The house exhaled. I went to the study and opened the notebook again. Under when I wrote a single sentence, "Soon, but not tomorrow." Then I drew a small square on the page, like the outline of a room. In one corner, I wrote the initials my father had scratched into the wood. In the opposite corner, I wrote my son's name. On the line between them, I wrote the words that would carry me through what came next. Patience, proof, exposure. I closed the notebook and placed it neatly in the desk drawer. The decision had completed its circle inside me. I would not shout. I would not run. I would let the truth grow teeth, and then I would let it bite where it must. The breaking point did not arrive with raised voices or a slammed door. It arrived with the soft click of that drawer sliding shut. That sound marked the end of who I had been and the beginning of what I was about to become, a strategist. Father who refused to be blind. A son who would honor his own father with action, rather than grief. The night stretched long. I stood by the window and watched the streetlights cast white pools on the asphalt. Somewhere a dog barked once, then stopped as if it too had decided silence was wiser. When I finally lay down, I felt no peace. I did feel purpose. It warmed my chest like a slow fire. By morning, the plan would begin. It would not explode. It would root itself. And when it finally surfaced, it would not be a scene. It would be a verdict. I closed my eyes and saw the guest room door. Not the new one, but the old one with the carved initials. I imagined my father's hand, thin and steady, pressing the point of a screw into the wood again and again, letter by letter. He had marked a path for me. I would walk it. Tomorrow I would gather the first witness. Tomorrow I would capture the first recording. Tomorrow I would start placing the pieces of a puzzle whose picture my son would not recognize until it was too late. Justice was not a thunderclap. Was a house being rebuilt one beam at a time, and I had just lifted the first board. When morning came, I felt like I was waking in a stranger's house again. The walls looked cleaner, the air more polished, yet it was the same home that had hidden a secret so ugly that I could almost hear it breathing beneath the paint. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the steam curl above the mug. I had reached the stage where emotion turns into structure. Rage had become architecture. I opened the notebook where I had written patience, proof, exposure, and added a fourth word beneath it, timing. Justice without timing is noise. I wanted precision. I wanted him to understand, when the floor finally gave way under his feet, that it was not fate that destroyed him. It was arithmetic. The first step was simple: find everything he did not know I still owned. I searched through my father's old workshop again, tracing the past for signatures and patterns. There were canceled checks, phone bills, old ledgers. Some were from companies my son had created, others from accounts my father had forgotten. I photographed every page. Then I visited Victor again, the retired attorney. We met in his back garden, away from his neighbors. The smell of wet leaves filled the air. He poured coffee and leaned forward while I laid out what I had gathered. He spoke quietly. You have enough to start pressure, but not enough to crush him. He will deny everything and turn this into a family dispute. You need a moment that takes him off script. I nodded. That moment will come. I just need the world to listen when it does. Victor smiled. Then you build a story with witnesses. Truth alone is fragile. Truth seen by others becomes iron. So that became my next phase. I began visiting people my son underestimated. The locksmith, the notary, the hospital administrator who had handled my father's admission. I asked them questions, never threats, always polite. I made sure they remembered the details in their own words. The locksmith's wife mentioned something that nearly made me stop breathing. Your son paid extra for silence, she said. He said the room was for sensitive materials. She frowned. My husband thought he meant money or documents. Not a person. I asked if she would write that down. She did. I folded the note into my jacket pocket as carefully as if it were glass. That night, I installed a small camera in the study. It was hidden inside an old clock above the bookshelf. The lens pointed toward the desk where he sometimes reviewed documents when he thought I was asleep. I left the drawer of the desk slightly open, the edge of one document visible, a fake ledger I had created with deliberate inconsistencies. I wanted to see if curiosity would outweigh caution. 2 nights later, he took the bait. I watched the footage quietly from my phone in the garage. At 11:36 p.m., he entered the study, turned on the lamp, and pulled the document out of the drawer. He photographed it with his phone, frowned, then placed it back exactly as he found it. That single act told me everything. He was still checking to see how much I knew. He still believed I was manageable. I saved the recording to 3 different drives. The next morning, I acted as if nothing had happened. Over breakfast, he mentioned plans for the weekend, casual, smooth, almost kind. I listened, nodded, and replied with the same even tone I had practiced in mirrors as a younger man learning negotiation. When he left, I called Victor again. "He's still gathering information," I said. "Then he's nervous," Victor replied. Nervous people leave footprints. By the end of the week, I had found them. Hidden emails, property transfers, digital backups on an old cloud account I had forgotten existed, but that he had used for years. Each file was another layer of deception. Bank statements naming his shell company, payment confirmations for the lock installation, even text messages with a contractor describing soundproofing the guest room. I forwarded everything to Victor's secure folder. His reply came minutes later. "This is enough to start a case. But do you want a court victory or a confession?" I stared at the message for a long time. I did not want the system to fix this. I wanted the truth to reveal itself in front of him. I wanted him to stand in the same silence he had left my father in and hear his own echo. I wrote back, "Confession," in his own voice. To get that, I needed a stage. Not public, not yet. Family first. I called my sister, who lived in another city. She had loved my father fiercely, but had always distrusted my son's ambition. I told her that Dad was alive. The phone went silent for almost a full minute before she whispered, "You were joking." When I told her the truth, she said only one thing. "Tell me what you need." She became my silent witness. The plan was simple. In 2 weeks, we would host what I called a small family meeting at the house, under the pretext of discussing inheritance adjustments after new findings. My son would not suspect her presence until the last moment. In the meantime, I began feeding him fragments of false calm. I told him I wanted to avoid legal complications. I said I wanted to sign some revised agreements, to simplify things before I retired. His shoulders relaxed when he heard that. He wanted to believe that the old version of me had returned trusting, distracted, slow. "Good idea," he said, patting my shoulder with a smile that made my skin crawl. "You've been under stress." "Let me handle the drafts." "Of course," I said. "But I want us both present when we finalize it." "Transparency helps everyone," he agreed. Of course he did. He thought transparency meant control. Over the following days, I rewired the living room. 2 small microphones hidden near the mantel and another near the ceiling light. The signal connected to a discrete recorder in the study. I rehearsed the questions I would ask, the order of the revelations, the tone of voice that would keep him talking. Each night, I tested the equipment, adjusting for echo. The act felt strange at first, a man turning his home into an evidence chamber. But I reminded myself, this was the same room where he had lied to my face. Truth deserved better acoustics. The day before the meeting, I visited my father one last time. He was stronger, his cheeks fuller, though the sadness never fully left his eyes. When I told him what I planned, he sighed. "I do not want to see him punished," he said quietly. "I want him to see himself." "That is exactly what I intend," I replied. He nodded slowly. "Then promise me something. When it's over, you let go. Do not build your life around this," I promised. I meant it, or at least I wanted to. The afternoon arrived, dressed in deceptive peace. The light outside was golden, the kind that fools you into thinking the world is kind again. My sister arrived first, quiet and composed, wearing a pale coat that made her look like she had walked straight out of memory. I led her to the small room beside the kitchen, where she could hear everything without being seen. My son arrived 30 minutes later, carrying a folder and that same scent of expensive confidence. He greeted me warmly, too warmly, and sat across from me. "So, these are the new papers," he said, laying the folder on the table. "Before we sign anything," I said, "I want to talk about what happened to your grandfather." He paused, then smiled faintly. "We already did this, Dad. You said you understood." "No," I said calmly. "You misunderstood my silence. I understand now, but not the way you think." He shifted in his seat. "I made mistakes. I admit that. But you forged my signature," I interrupted. His eyes flicked toward the folder, then back at me. "Dad, come on. You know how paperwork works. Clerical mix-ups happen. You bribed a locksmith to build a cell in my house. That stopped him. He stared at me, expression blank, the kind of stillness that only guilty men learn. "Where did you get that idea?" he said finally. "From the invoices, from the witness statements, from the camera footage." He inhaled sharply. "You've been spying on me?" "I have been documenting history," I said. "Because lies fade without witnesses." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he laughed softly, shaking his head. "You really think anyone will believe this? It's your word against mine." "I'll say you're losing touch. Stress, age, trauma. Everyone knows you've been off lately." I leaned forward. "That's why I installed microphones." The words hit him like cold water. His smile faltered. "You're bluffing." I pressed a small remote on the table. From the next room, his own voice filled the air, the recording from weeks ago when he had spoken on the phone to the contractor. "Yes, make sure the door opens only from the outside. It's for safety." His face drained of color. That could be edited," he stammered. "True," I said. "But the timestamps, the payments, the bank transfers, and the emails can't be. Nor can the statement from the notary. Nor can your mother's brother, who heard you boasting about streamlining the process." His breathing quickened. "You're ruining your own family." "No," I said softly. "I'm restoring it." He stood up, knocking the chair backward. "You don't know what you're doing. You'll regret this." "Sit down," I said, my voice steady. "This isn't done yet," he hesitated. And in that hesitation, my sister stepped out of the side room. The sight of her froze him. "Aunt?" he whispered. She looked at him the way a mirror looks at a thief, calm, unblinking, absolute. "I came to see what kind of man you became," she said. His shoulders dropped. The performance was over. For the next hour, I let the silence stretch while he stammered through half-truths and desperate attempts to rewrite the story. Every sentence tightened the noose. When he finally realized there was no escape, he said, "What do you want me to do?" I slid a document toward him, a legal declaration drafted by Victor that transferred control of the estate back to my father and confessed to falsifying prior documents. "Sign it," I said. He read it slowly, trembling. "If I sign this, I lose everything." "You already did," I said. He signed. I watched the pen move across the page, the ink drying like an ending. When it was over, he stood silently. "Are you going to the police?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not yet. But understand this, every copy of this confession, every recording, every document is stored in places you will never reach. If you disappear, they will not." He nodded, pale and shaking. "You think this makes you the hero?" "No," I said quietly. "It makes me the witness." He walked out without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, softer than I expected. My sister stepped closer and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did it," she whispered. I nodded, though it didn't feel like victory. It felt like surgery. Necessary, sterile, without joy. Word travels faster than guilt. Within 2 days, the signed confession reached the lawyer, the notary, and the bank. By the end of the week, my son's accounts were frozen, his shell company flagged, and the estate's ownership restored to my father's name. I didn't need to chase revenge anymore. It had begun moving on its own, like a quiet tide reclaiming what was stolen. He called once. I let it ring. The message he left was long, apologetic, and hollow, every sentence crafted for pity. I didn't erase it. I wanted him to know his words were no longer currency here. The truth had already been cashed in. 2 days later, police cars arrived at the office he had used for his fake business. Not because I called them, but because Victor had turned over the notarized statements to an investigator he trusted. My hands were clean, but my silence was precise. There are moments when justice doesn't roar. It simply arrives with paperwork and cold metal bracelets. That evening, I stood outside my father's workshop with him beside me. He was weak but smiling. The sunset poured gold across the windows, lighting up the dust like old ghosts made visible. "You did what you had to," he said quietly. "You did it without shouting." "I learned that from you," I replied. "When something breaks, fix it quietly before others hear the noise." He chuckled softly, the sound of a man remembering better years. Inside, the smell of iron and wood greeted us like an old hymn. I helped him sit, and for a moment, everything felt whole again. Not perfect whole. That's rarer. Days passed, and life began to mend itself around the truth. My son was not imprisoned long only enough for the world to see who he truly was. He lost his company, his reputation, his comfort. I lost something too. The illusion that family loyalty could survive unchecked greed. But I gained clarity, and clarity is a kind of peace. Sometimes at night, I still hear whispers in the house. But they're not from behind a locked door anymore. They're echoes of conscience, reminders that silence can be both a weapon and a sanctuary. The kind that teaches you the difference between forgiveness and foolishness. When I walk down the hall, I glance at the new door. It no longer hides secrets. It stands open, light spilling through, my father's initials framed above it in a small plaque. I put it there myself not as a monument to suffering, but as proof that no lie survives where truth is patient. In the end, I didn't ruin my son. I let his choices speak louder than my anger. I didn't destroy him. I uncovered him. And now, as I sit here telling you this, I'll ask you what I've asked myself every night since. If you found a door in your home that whispered your name, would you open it? What would you have done in my place? Comment below, like this video, and subscribe for more stories.